Hello, my name is John Monaghan and I'm the Head of Research at Square Mile Investment Research and Consulting. Today I'm talking to Paul Jordan about Amati's approach to ESG investing and how that's incorporated into their process. So Paul, perhaps you could tell us how you integrate ESG factors into your research process.
Yeah, thanks, John. As you know, ESG has become a major topic amongst investment management firms over the last few years. But really for us, I think this has been a journey which I would say we've been on for about 15 years. When I first became a fund manager, I was running a fund that was called an ethical fund. And the way that worked was we had some consultants and they had to they produced a list every couple of months and I could only buy stocks on that list. And that's kind of how ethical investing was done back in the early part of the 2000s. I think really my journey since then has been, first of all, to understand that in this job we do, the ethical dimensions of what a fund manager does are massively important. And it's, one of the jobs of our industry is to allocate capital efficiently and to get it to the right places. But in doing so, we have an influence on the kind of businesses that form, how they operate, what kind of cultures they have, what they do, and so that capital allocation is intensely linked to ethics in an important way, but it's not a simple way. And so I think actually what the whole fund management industry has been through since then has been this period of reflection where we tried to work out, well, in what way are these things effectively linked, and how do we make that explicit, do we make it implicit? And so there's a whole range of terminology that's come up, and one of the favorite words amongst fund managers is integration. So some fund managers say, well, we take the approach of integrating ESG. In fact, almost every fund manager, I think, will say that at the least. And what does that mean? Well, it can take one of two forms. And one form is where you stick to that old model where you have a group of people either inside the company or outside the company who are your ESG department. And they do the analysis and they then tell the fund managers, well, this is what you can do and this is what you can't do. I've never been in favor of that approach. And I think it's actually quite deeply flawed, because for me, the ethical dimensions of what we do are both complex and subtle, and they're inextricably linked to how one analyzes a company. So I think the approach that we really adopt at Amati is one where we say that this is something that's built into the way we analyze companies. It's integrated in the sense that it's part of our investment process in a not in a simplistic way. It's not just an additional filter. When we get to the end, we say, oh, well, what about these other things to tick the boxes? I'm also pretty strongly against a mentality which says we can boil this down to a set of boxes to tick, or even to a numerical score. I don't think these things can be boiled down to numerical scores. I'm actually a strong believer, and maybe this is because I'm a small company investor, that one of the problems in financial services is that one of the big problems arises when it becomes unitized and impersonalized, and everything's done in a sort of productized form where the end investor is buying a product and it's churned through so many different iterations that it's a million miles away from the actual companies that are invested in. And I like to think one of the things we do at Amati is to kind of shorten that, and we try to bring our investors as much as we can into contact with the companies they're investing in by writing about them, by talking about them. And so that face-to-faceness, I think, is actually is one of the fundamental parts of investment ethics, actually. And if our investors came face-to-face with the companies, would they be proud of them, or would they think, oh, crumbs, I really don't like what's going on here? And so the kind of questions we're trying to ask I think, are digging quite deep. And that, I think, as we go on in this discussion, hopefully it'll become clear that we're trying to not take a simplistic approach. I think box ticking, I think, is massively counterproductive. Achieves next to nothing, and in fact sometimes the exact opposite of what you think it might achieve. And also simplistic ideas along the lines of, oh, well, let's not invest in XYZ sector because it must be bad, also I think tends to lead to the huge potential for counterproductive results. So, ultimately, what we're trying to do is invest in companies that the people who invest in our funds could feel proud of.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess there's a couple of takeaways from that sort of opening set of remarks, Paul. First of all, around the sort of belief that outsourcing, in inverted commas, ESG research is suboptimal, particularly when you're dealing with smaller companies. And I guess when you are speaking to smaller companies, it's important to get a feel for their culture. I mean, perhaps you could sort of expand on that and how you sort of think about that.
Yes, I mean, Warren Buffett used to say that you should never invest in a company run by people you don't like. And actually, there is quite a big element of truth behind that remark. I mean, as is typical of Warren Buffett, he throws out these wonderful aphorisms, and they contain kernels of real wisdom. I mean, I think for me, the important part of that idea is that investment should be also about relationships. And we, as small company investors, we're in the very fortunate position, I think, of being able to form relationships with the people that we're effectively backing a set of people to run businesses. And it is that face-to-faceness part of it I really value and like, and I think it's an important part of the job that should be celebrated. Clearly there are sort of all kinds of regulatory thoughts that immediately spring to mind. Well, if you have a relationship with these people, does that mean you're somehow, risking some of the sort of regulatory restrictions about public markets? I don't think the two things are incompatible. You can have a relationship with a management team. It's very important that you do, as an investor, without crossing any boundaries that protect public markets. But I think it's important for especially larger investors, and funds are typically going to be larger investors in companies, to the best way to hold a company to account is to have a relationship with the management team by far. And I've not come across any other effective way to do it, so that when if a management team is inclined to do something that you really think is either unwise or objectionable in some way, you're much more likely to have an influence. And I think a lot of the way ESG has gone is, in a way, the whole motivating force in a way behind ESG is to have an influence on companies. And the starting point for that is a relationship. It's why, ultimately box ticking, I think, is reasonably ineffective in comparison to that. And it's, one might say, well, that's a cop-out because you need to measure everything. Well, there's this whole other area in ESG which is being wrestled with. Well, how do you measure things? And some things can be measured and some things really can't. And actually, some of the most important things can't be measured. So, we're in this position at the moment where I think we're very proactive in terms of our approach in many dimensions. I mean, this is not a single topic. ESG spans such a wide range. It's almost impossible to talk about it as one notion. But I think we're very proactive on many fronts with it.
Sure. Yeah. And to the point you made about sort of speaking to companies and dealing with them, therefore sort of interaction is very, very important. So are you saying then that, just for example, if we consider environmental issues, if we just merely exclude stocks from our investment universe, that's also a route that you don't particularly want to go down, because that interaction is very important?
Yes, and obviously one of the big areas of ESG, the E of ESG, the environmental side of it, is probably it's probably the thing which more than anything else has brought the idea into being. The realization that, well, we have to do something about climate change. And so, I think there's a school of thought out there which says, well, in order to make an ethical investment, therefore you cannot invest in fossil fuels. And while I've got some sympathy with that view, it's not our current chosen route. And the reason is that I would go down. I think a much more productive, well, first, on the one hand, I think a much more productive way of seeing this is to invest in the means of change. So in the new technologies, the things which are going to allow us to do something different than just driving fossil fuel driven vehicles around and heating our homes with gas and so on. But in the meantime, we've also got to recognize that if we were to simply abandon the production of fossil fuels right now, it would be geopolitical mayhem. And so, part of my thinking in this respect is that we have to have a thought of actually investing in a way that does protect our national interests, and the not just Britain's national interests, but the interests of the free world in general, where we'd be in big danger if we just gave up investing in fossil fuels right now when we're still using them so much and so dependent on them still. We would simply be buying them from further afield, from regimes where we're going to cause a huge amount of trouble by sending that much money in their direction. And you'll know what I'm talking about. Oil and gas, one of its most problematic sides has been how it's funded some of the most violent and vicious dictatorships in the world over 60, 70 years. And if you like, that's the dimension of investing in natural resources that really motivates me. So I think we should still keep an open mind about investing in fossil fuels. I don't think we should say we're not going to do it because of the geopolitical dimension. It's too soon still to take that approach. But we also need to think about investing in the means of replacing them and all the new technologies. But when we do invest in fossil fuels, we need to make sure we're not funding violent, oppressive regimes, which are, if you like, solely kept alive by the natural resource revenues that they derive from the West. And so, I think that's, for me, that's a very clear area that we can do something about it. There's a huge imperative to do that. But I'm not yet at the point where I think we should just be disinvesting from all oil and gas companies. I appreciate some people do think that. It does create some more pressure for change if you do it. But I think the counter argument about it is geopolitics. And I think we could cause, so I always think about, well, if everybody adopted the policies that we adopt, would it be a good thing or a bad thing? And I want policies that I feel could be widely adopted and beneficial at the same time if everybody did them. And I certainly think being much more careful about how one invests in natural resources along the lines of not funding these regimes would be hugely beneficial if everyone did it.
And looking at and sort of listening to some of the points that you've made, engagement is very important, obviously. And an observation I would make compared to a number of asset management firms, Amati is very transparent around publishing the voting records. I mean, why do you think it's so important to demonstrate this?
Well, I mean, I don't know how many people look at our published voting records, but I think transparency is something that we always really encourage in the companies we invest in. And it's quite hard to do that if one isn't transparent as a business ourselves. Clearly, we didn't think of that. Wasn't our idea. I'd like to think it was, but it wasn't. It comes from the people who drive the stewardship code, which has been updated many times over the last 10 years. And a couple of years ago, in order to be a tier 1 signatory to the stewardship code, it's a requirement that you publish all of your voting records. And in a sense, we were responding to that and thought, well, actually, yes, there's no argument not to do that. And so it's really, we were conforming to best practice by doing that and put in place procedures for publishing it. It's also, it does really focus the mind of a manager on what you're voting if you know it's public. And it helps us it motivates us to put more consideration into the ways in which we vote. And a lot of the voting is to do with remuneration, and remuneration is a topic we've been, I think, actively engaged in for a long time. It's a big topic. We certainly don't have all the answers for it. Again, I don't think it's possible to draw up firm sort of rules. This is about judgments and about what's appropriate for a business. And we'll very often be engaging with the chair of a remuneration committee in a company who, because they know we vote and they can see how we vote, they'll want to make sure we'll support their remuneration report. So, one of the positive factors about that's particularly happened this year is that before they make their decisions, they'll give us a call and discuss what they want, particularly in the cases where they know they want to diverge from the norms. And sometimes, we'll listen to the case and say, well, actually, I can understand why you want to do that, so we'll support it. It's not to say we'll always say no, but being included in that conversation, I think, should drive better outcomes.
I mean, it's a very important area, that engagement. Do you think you have a sort of a benefits over other competitors where they're dealing with larger companies? That sort of personal interaction in this small cap space is very valuable for your process.
Yes, I do think that's true. I think when we're dealing with larger companies, we don't deal with FTSE 100 companies, but the bigger companies get, the more remote they get from their investors. It's what I've noticed. I mean, perhaps that's not true of some of the very big investment houses, but because there's so many people involved, and the management teams, if you like, almost get trained at that kind of scale to keep a distance from investors. And I think the mentality becomes, I have seen it a little bit on one or two of the boards I've been on with company directors from larger companies. There is this sort of inculcation that investors are there to be sort of kept outside the door, not really seen as partners in a way. And we like to see ourselves as partners in the businesses that we're helping to create the companies that we invest in, not just buying a chip one day and then kicking it out the next. It's we do see it as a bit more of a partnership than that.
Just conscious of your time, Paul. I mean, the key takeaways for me from this have been the importance of engaging with companies, not excluding companies because they sit into a certain area of investment. For example, you mentioned the oil and gas sector. It's important to interact, and it's important to be transparent.
Yeah, and we have a set of sort of reasonably high level principles, covering most of the controversial topics. Whether it's it's easy to draw a list of them. The arms trade is obviously one that's divided a lot of investment opinion. Our view of that very quickly is we don't want to completely disinvest in the arms trade, because the corollary of that would be that we'd have an army with no weapons, which would be utterly hopeless. Clearly weapons are very controversial, but the area I think we need to be very focused on is to make sure we're not investing in companies that are providing weapons to regimes where they're going to be used for oppression. And it's controversial. I know the arms business is one of the murkiest and in many ways most corrupt in the world. So it's an area to be very careful of, and I think we are very careful of it. But to have a completely zero policy is to say that you don't want to support your own we shouldn't have an armed forces at all, because they're not going to have any weapons to fight with. So I wouldn't go to that kind of extreme, but I would also operate with a lot of caution. And there's areas like gambling. We don't actually we're not keen on investing in sort of gambling or addiction in general. I don't really want to invest in areas of addiction. So it's not gambling per se. So insofar as a company that makes its money from gambling is a leisure business, where the emphasis would be on entertainment, I wouldn't have an objection to it. I'm not trying to be moralistic about it. But insofar as any company we would invest in relies on addiction and addictive behavior, we'd be pretty unhappy about it. And that actually opens up a whole bigger discussion that would affect, here's a question: to what degree does the usage of social media rely on addiction? Tough question, a very relevant question. I don't have the answer to it, but I want to ask it. So that would be a very uncomfortable ESG type question to contemplate when investing in many of the world's largest and most successful businesses. And it's a dimension that has to be explored, albeit, were that to be in our investment universe, I'd be kind of trying to delve into that question quite hard. And so, there are these different areas where I just think it's important to have a high level view of what are your guiding principles going to be, and trying to be reasonably transparent about them. And obviously they evolve. We do write them down, and we write our principles down in our stewardship report, which is on our website. But we're not always shouting about them, because they're not a fixed thing. We think hard about the issues that are before us, and the world changes. So I think our thinking should be able to change with it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Paul. It's been a very fascinating conversation, and thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.